on aspects of sustainability, be that environmental or labour standard, more often in the work that we're looking at here, in the context of those relationships. And essentially, what we see in this work is that sustainability falls over when suppliers perceive that buyers are behaving unreasonably, unfairly, and without concern for the constraints that they face in meeting buyers' demands. So essentially, unsustainability is a rational response on the behalf of the supplier organisations to a perceived unfairness on the part of buying organisations, and I think that's really interesting. And what it says is that we need to pay much more attention to the nuts and bolts of the buyer-supplier interface as it manifests in, particularly here, in a developing or emerging economy context, where suppliers have very limited capabilities and want to meet the requirements of buyers, but have very limited capacity to do so, weighing against other pressures. So that's kind of where we're going with this study. This is in a sense, more professional diagrams are good. This came out of another study that we did a few years earlier that was about reflecting on different modes of orientation to the buyer-supplier relationship, and what we contrasted ultimately on the basis of a reflection largely on the academic and practitioner literature around sustainable supply chains was a model that we called a kind of command and control type model. We'll tell you what we want, and we'll tell you in great detail what we want, and then it'll either happen or it won't. And if you don't, if you can't do what we want you to do, then we'll move on and find someone else, which I think creates a set of incentives for suppliers to mislead buying organisations, which I think is another category of circumstance where things go wrong, with a more dialogical, developmental sort of process, which I think very much resonates with one of the conversations we've just been hearing from practice, whereby there's a process of real development and commitment within the context of the buyer-supplier relationship to investing in that relationship and building capacity among suppliers to truly deliver sustainable outcomes. So that's, I think, a process worth thinking about, and in our view, a process that's more likely to lead to the sorts of outcomes that we're looking to have developed. So last word from me. I mean, I think the power for me of this kind of work is that it looks at sustainability and aspects of sustainability, particular aspects of sustainability. I think that's important also, but it does so from the perspective of the supplying organisations. It tries to have a contextualised appreciation for what the capabilities and attitudes and preferences of those organisations are, and tries to say, look, if you want those organisations to do what you want them to do, and that's the nature of driving sustainability through global production networks or global value chains, it seems to me, then one needs to have a nuanced understanding of the real abilities of those organisations to deliver the sorts of outcomes that you want. Most work, it strikes me, in operations management and supply chains, where I dabble, tends to focus on the buying side of things, tends to work, with those companies local to us that we can go and talk to. It tends not to go and get our hands dirty in the context of the corners of the world where all the stuff that we wear and eat and play with get made. And I think more work that is sympathetic to those sorts of perspectives, I think, would do us a great service in really generating more sustainable value chains. Anyway, I will stop there.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all for being brief and to the point. We're really three very interesting presentations. Maybe we'll open up now for some conversations, and I'll start asking questions, and then maybe we'll take a few questions from the audience. Looking at the Modern Slavery Act, the one that passed in the UK and the one that is about to pass here in Australia, how do you think that would affect operation management and supply chains in businesses? and how can businesses prepare their operation management in order to comply with this? Laura, do you want to start?
Yes, I've written numerous consultation papers on this, so it's a topic hot on mind. So I guess most people, or just a brief update. So recently the Attorney General's Department of Australia just a week or two ago they've signalled the draft legislation, but they've now given us a commitment and a timeline that this will kind of aim to be out, if we have a government under the Constitution, in first sit-in week, kind of early next year. So kind of they're looking around February or March. And so there's what they've called a modern slavery reporting requirement for business. It looks quite similar to the UK legislation. So at the moment, although this all needs to be debated, but they're looking at companies with over a threshold of $100 million of Australian turnover need to report on the actions they're taking to address modern slavery in their supply chains. So modern slavery in this instance is anything from forced labour, human trafficking and debt bondage. And also child labour and worse forms of child labour. So I think what Australian companies can expect, and building on kind of our experience and working through what has happened in the UK. So the significant piece of this legislation is that directors need to sign this off. So for sustainability professionals who may have been harping on about this stuff for a long while, it's kind of, they see it as another lever that they can use to escalate this to a board level, and quite often get more resources that they need to do the programs that they want to do. In terms of operations, it really means you've got to activate how you do procurement and put that extra kind of broader human rights lens with the focus, targeted focus on modern slavery. But I think it's important to note that modern slavery doesn't happen in a vacuum, and there's usually a spectrum of rights abuses that happen before you get to that situation of modern slavery. So quite often, if you find modern slavery, you would also find a spectrum of other rights violations, which is why I think in this conversation we also need to talk about, I guess, other human rights. So practically speaking, it will look at kind of operationally things from obviously your policy statements, but then also when you go to your request for tenders, how you evaluate suppliers, what type of verification you're asking for up front, and then also once they're in your supply chain, how you're monitoring that process, and that then becomes the whole nice wheel that you had kind of up just a second ago. But it's, I could talk about this all day, so I'll stop there, but it's an exciting development, and I think from a supply chain perspective, and particularly a reporting perspective, we need to be conscious that companies, though, aren't overburdened from the reporting side of it, as legislation is also springing up in other jurisdictions. For a multinational company, I guess that's the greatest concern at the moment, is how long do we have to spend in reporting these slight nuances in other jurisdictions, considering the UK already has it.
Thank you so much. It's quite astonishing to think that in 2017 we have over 45 million people who are either forced to work or work in non-livable conditions. 45 million. It's more than we ever had in any of our human history. And it will be interesting to see the effect of these acts and similar acts, not just because of the legislation, but also because of the awareness raised to these issues. Anyone else want to discuss modern slavery? All right. Anyone has any questions?
Just to follow up on what you were talking about, Laura, there is a lot of non-governmental organizations as well, producing standards and certifications, living wage coalition and others. So how do you see the interplay between what governments are doing and NGOs are doing?
NGO and civil society having the role that they play, and I used to work for one, so I'm certainly an ally and a friend to the NGO community. They then started taking corporations rightfully to account, and they still do. From a kind of fast forward to now, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights was a voluntary initiative, again from that NGO space, and it has been seen that it hasn't led to the type of change that the UN among civil society wanted to see quick enough. So that's led to this period of legislation starting kind of not even with the UK Modern Slavery Act, but back with the California Transparency Act in the US in about 2012. So the US has been quite leading this area, followed by the Dodd-Frank Act, dare I say, that Trump has just repealed, that required electronics companies particularly to, that was around the conflict minerals piece. And then they've also had federal acquisition regulation around human trafficking into federal supply chains. So that's the US has led in that, and since then we're seeing the UK and now the EU and now Australia, particularly on the slavery piece. And that's the argument is that businesses haven't moved far enough, or quick enough, which I tend to agree with. The other piece of the NGO, their role is really cropping up in benchmarking. I have a love-hate relationship with benchmarks because it really comes down to the methodology and how well that's occurred. So I think there's some quite good benchmarks out there. There's also a proliferation of benchmarks, and for a company to be requested every other week to fill in a spreadsheet with 150 different data points is quite taxing, and then you can be penalised by the NGO community for not participating, which there's kind of this misunderstanding perhaps about the resource burden it takes for a company to do so. And so I don't know where I was going with all of that, but I totally think there's a role for civil society and NGOs, and I mean there's a lot of commentary around the legislation that at the moment there's no penalties, and the idea of penalty is civil society will hold you to account because you have made a global, or you've made a public commitment rather, if that answers your question vaguely. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Any other questions from the audience? Yes.
So any discussion in your organizations with the rise of robotics and automation to actually bring manufacturing into that?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So the automation of work and AIs, and how is that going to affect operation management, but also how is it going to affect sustainability and the social impact that we could have with this